Welcome to the Osteoarthritis Action Alliance Lunch and Learn webinar for November 20th, 2019. Thank you for joining us this month. Our presenter today is Anthony Perruccio. Dr. Perruccio is an epidemiologist and scientist in the Arthritis Institute at Krembil Research Institute and assistant professor at Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. His research seeks to quantify and better understand the impact of osteoarthritis on individuals and in the population, and additionally to identify distinct osteoarthritis subgroups within clinical and population-based cohorts, with a particular focus on sex differences. His presentation today is titled Understanding the Impact of Osteoarthritis on Social Participation, a Population-Based Study. Welcome, Dr. Perruccio.
Thank you very much. Are you able to see my slide on screen?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the OA Action Alliance for the invitation to speak. If I may take just a moment to commend the Alliance leadership and its teams for their incredible work on shining a very bright and very much needed spotlight on the significant individual and public health burden that is osteoarthritis. So congratulations on excellent work. Today we'll present the results from a study aimed at understanding the impact of OA on social participation. Although I am presenting the work, I want to acknowledge my co-investigators in the project that I have listed here, without whom this work could not have been accomplished. Concerted efforts have led to unprecedented gains in life expectancy in developed nations over the past century, and this is contributing to a burgeoning aging population. An implicit assumption is that an extended life is always beneficial. However, added years leave individuals at risk for developing age-related, non-fatal, often disabling conditions later in life, or living longer with disabling conditions developed in early or middle adulthood. The most often cited disease within this context is osteoarthritis, in fact. The concern then with this shift in the population is further increasing pressures on health and social services and public health and infrastructure. And there are already considerable economic pressures on these systems as it is. In 2017 and 18, the World Health Organization proposed action plans on aging and health with the explicit intent of stretching healthy years well into old age. Healthy aging is now a population health priority within individual nations and globally. With no known cure for osteoarthritis, no treatments that can slow or stop its progression, and recognizing that it is a leading cause of disability in the population, it is undeniable that OA is a leading threat to healthy aging. So what is healthy aging? While it is suggested that successful healthy aging has three components, so low disease or disease-related disability, high cognitive and physical functional capacity, and active engagement in life, the dominant focus has been on disease and disability in activities of daily living. And this is particularly true in OA research. This contrasts, however, with findings from many qualitative studies in which older adults more commonly endorse social participation and positive outlook toward life as components of successful and healthy aging, rather than with activity limitations and disease specifically, although these are certainly identified as important factors. So what is social participation? It is generally understood to be the domain of functioning beyond impairments in the performance of basic activities, referring rather to involvement in life situations. And I've already alluded to results from qualitative studies, and I should say that results have been quite consistent across varied populations, highlighting social participation as a key to successful aging. It has been well documented that preserving social participation is closely linked with better health and quality of life, satisfaction with life, and lower mortality. And it is for this reason maintaining and improving social participation is a key component of the World Health Organization's Action Plan on Aging and Health, and indeed is in the public health policy frameworks of several developed nations, including Canada and the US. So what do we know about OA and social participation? Unfortunately, not very much. And of studies that have looked at participation in OA, work has largely been based on clinical samples characterized by advanced disease or symptoms, unlike the broader community reality of varying degrees of disease and symptoms. In addition, there has been a lack of a use of a conceptual framework to help guide the selection of measures across several domains of health and functioning that might influence social participation, and consideration of personal and environmental contextual factors. The bottom line, we know social participation is a key element for healthy aging, but we know little about OA and social participation. What we need is a comprehensive investigation to identify factors that potentially influence social participation in OA, with the ultimate goal of targeting efforts to facilitate maintaining or improving social participation to promote healthy aging in OA. Broadly speaking, what do we know impacts on social participation? While chronic pain impacts several domains of health, the vast majority of studies have focused on activities of daily living and mobility. Limited activity due to pain can lead to further restriction, decreased participation, and greater disability. And I will point out that several authors have noted a scarcity of studies and a resulting critical need to focus on social outcomes of pain, especially in an aging society. Activity is intimately linked to health status and quality of life, and activity restriction is one of the most powerful determinants of poor participation, loss of independence, institutionalization, and death. The ability to tackle daily activities is viewed as essential to active aging, allowing individuals to lead socially active and independent lives. Personal factors, for example, age and gender and education, are certainly recognized to be related to social participation, as are environmental factors. These are, excuse me, these are aspects that are extrinsic to individuals, and they relate to immediate social, physical environments to which individuals are exposed. So, for example, user-friendliness of the physical environment and positive perceptions of the local area have been shown to promote social participation. While environmental factors, such as income inadequacy, can overwhelm personal capacities and can limit social participation. An important environmental factor that is often discussed but not always considered is social support. This includes emotional support. So, for example, having someone available to share thoughts and feelings with, and instrumental supports, that is doing things for people. And by way of example here, help with personal care, indoor and outdoor housework, transportation. Authors have suggested that the availability, the type, and the extent of social support may differentially impact the association between activity and subsequent social participation, but there has been only limited work in this area. A comprehensive synthesis of studies that focused on the importance of environmental factors for mobility and for social participation reported that few studies, and in this case it's 12%, few studies considered the context of persons with activity restrictions. And I will highlight here that more than 3/4 of individuals with OA report some level of activity restriction. 40% of the studies did not consider social participation. Over 30% of the studies involved fewer than 150 participants. Studies were almost exclusively based on adult samples aged 65 plus or 75 plus years of age. And I will highlight here that more than half of individuals with OA are in fact below the age of 65. And less than half of the studies considered social support. The authors of this review emphasize that the development of interventions to maintain or to improve social participation, particularly among those with disabilities, is severely hampered by these identified limitations. So all of that was by way of background for the current study. So the objective of this study that I'm presenting was to investigate the relationship between OA and social participation, taking into account the contributions of pain, activity limitations, and instrumental supports. And the work was underpinned by the ICF conceptual framework. And I include here a depiction of our conceptual model going into the study. The goal essentially was to deconstruct the association between OA and social participation. In the diagram here, the squares represent observed measures and the ovals depict latent variables, and I will discuss this on a subsequent slide. The Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, the CLSA, is a longitudinal nationwide study of a representative sample of Canadians aged 45 to 85 years, and these individuals will be followed over a 20-year period. The study collects information on sociodemographic, psychosocial, behavioral, and health-related characteristics, among others. The current study makes use of recently released baseline data for this cohort, and it is based on what is called the tracking sample of the CLSA. This includes over 20,000 individuals for whom data on activities of daily living were collected. The CLSA measures used in our study included a designation of whether individuals reported doctor-diagnosed OA in the knee, hip, or hand. Individuals were asked about day-to-day pain or discomfort, and for those reporting in the affirmative, intensity was recorded as noted. And respondents were also asked about the extent of difficulty in performing 14 specific activities. So for example, reaching, kneeling, and walking. We had information on instrumental supports, and in fact had data on both perceptions of availability of instrumental supports and on whether instrumental support was received. Respondents were asked how often they had available supports if they needed them for each of 4 scenarios. Respondents were also asked if they had received instrumental supports in the past 12 months due to limitations or a health condition with 6 specific activities. Respondents were also asked a range of questions about social activities. The interest for our study was in discretionary social activities, and these included a total of 17 activities. So examples include recreational shopping, visiting with family and friends, recreational activities with others, including educational and cultural activities, and so on. And a list of additional measures were also considered, and I have listed them at the bottom of the slide here. A structural equation modeling framework was adopted for the study, facilitating the use of latent variables and the testing of pathways between factors, as I showed you in the diagram. A latent variable was created for activity limitations, for the instrumental support variables as well. Social participation has not been well characterized in the literature, so we undertook an exploratory factor analysis to assess the dimensionality of an underlying social participation construct based on the 17 items. Following the EFA, a confirmatory factor analysis was then undertaken. And to do this, the sample was randomly split into 2. The EFA was carried out in one group, and the CFA and the subsequent structural analysis undertaken in the second group. And although it was not reflected in the diagram of the model I showed you, we did include sociodemographic and health characteristics as potential predictors of OA and pain, activity limitations, instrumental supports, and the social participation factors. Finally, the criteria used to judge overall model fit is noted here at the bottom. So here are the characteristics of the randomly split samples that were used for the EFA and the CFA and subsequent structural analysis. We found no differences between the groups, as you can see. Mean age was 60 years, and half the sample was female. Just over 1/5 were obese. OA was reported by 24% of the sample. 40% of the sample reported some level of day-to-day pain, and by way of comparison, this was 60% among those with OA. And 34% of the overall sample reported difficulty with at least 2 activities of daily living. And this proportion was about 60 among those with OA. From our exploratory, followed by confirmatory factor analysis, 2 distinct indicators of social participation emerged. The first related to the diversity of activities routinely made in a typical week outside the home. This was based on 5 of the 17 items, and we have labeled this SP diversity. The second related to the intensity of community and recreational engagement. This was based on 12 of the 17 items, and we have labeled this SP intensity. The distinctness of these 2 social participation indicators certainly was evident from the very low correlation between them at a value of 0.23. So what did we find? First, we found an expected overall association between OA and lower social participation. And I will show the results in diagram form. A table would have been too cumbersome. And I will slowly build the diagram as I present the results. So here we have, I don't know if you can see the pointer as I do here. Here we have dashed lines connecting OA and social participation. Dashed lines represent negative regression coefficients. So OA is associated with lower diversity scores and lower social participation intensity scores. We also found the negative effects of pain on social participation were fully mediated by activity limitations. And there are 3 things to note here. The association between OA and activity limitations is in part direct and in part through pain. So OA related to pain, then related to activity limitations. The negative effect of pain on social participation is fully mediated through activity limitations. And third, note that the negative effect of OA on social participation is through pain and activity limitations. But also note here the appearance of these 2 lines. The solid lines denote a positive association. So having accounted for pain and activity limitations, individuals with OA had higher social participation scores than those without. Now, put another way, for individuals with OA but without day-to-day pain and activity limitations, their social participation scores were higher. Finally, while greater limitations were associated with reduced social participation, the effects were in part buffered or mitigated by instrumental supports. This is what the final model looked like. These are all standardized and significant estimates here. But I removed the estimates to make the slides less busy, and I will walk you through the findings. We certainly had a more complex model in the end than we had anticipated initially. Here you see that the effect of activity limitations on lower participation scores were in part direct, but we also see that the negative effects are partially mitigated by instrumental supports. So we have here individuals with activity limitations going to supports going to social participation. The unexpected finding was that received instrumental supports buffered the effects only for diversity, while perceived availability of instrumental support buffered the effects only for intensity. These were certainly novel findings. So individuals with more activity limitations are receiving more instrumental support, and the more support that is received, the higher is social participation diversity. Individuals with higher activity limitations, in fact, perceived less availability of support. Nevertheless, the higher the perception of availability, the higher was social participation. Recall that the correlation between the two social participation indicators was only 0.23, indicating distinct indicators. And the correlation between the two instrumental supports indicator variables also was very low at 0.14, indicating as well the distinctness of these two indicators. The distinctness of the two SP indicators was evident by the low correlation between them, as I've indicated, by their unique associations with the two instrumental support indicators, but also by different pattern of relationships with the covariates. And I have put these in table format with symbols. If a symbol appears, it was significant association in either a positive or a negative direction as indicated. And I have highlighted here in red the columns for the social participation indicators. So note, for example, that being female and having higher education were associated with greater social participation intensity, but were unrelated to participation diversity. Again, highlighting that these two are distinct indicators. Similarly, the distinctness of the two instrumental support indicators was shown not only by a low correlation between them, but also unique associations with the covariates. So by way of example, being female was associated with lower perceived availability of support, but greater received support. And smokers and individuals with more comorbidities had lower perceived availability of instrumental support, but this was unrelated to whether they received supports. So those were the results. The study, of course, any study will have its limitations. Respondents were only asked about OA in the knee, hip, and hand. While these certainly are the most frequently affected joints in OA, those with OA in other joints would have been missed in our OA designation. The study considered the only available data for this cohort, and that was the baseline data. Because of its cross-sectional nature, our results have to be understood within the context of associations rather than causal processes. With this said, however, this work is the necessary first step before considering longitudinal relationships, and work will begin shortly in this regard as longitudinal data becomes available for this cohort. I indicated earlier that our environmental neighborhood factors may influence social participation. Unfortunately, we did not have suitable measures for these factors. I am not certain the extent, if any, to which these factors would have altered the associations we found, but certainly their inclusion may have added an important layer to our understanding of what may influence social participation in OA. Finally, some suggest that emotional support may be as helpful as instrumental support for people living with pain. Emotional support was not included here, but what I suspect is that it may provide further buffering or mitigating effects for the negative association between activity limitations and social participation. So to conclude, what are the takeaway messages with respect to understanding OA and social participation? For those without day-to-day pain, OA was directly associated with greater social participation. And this may reflect perhaps proactive steps taken by people with mild OA to maintain activity and social engagement. An important item to highlight is that without considering the in-between pathways that I showed you between OA and social participation, the true impact of OA on participation was in part masked by the combining of the positive effects among those without day-to-day pain together with the negative effects among those with day-to-day pain. For those with day-to-day pain, the pathway between OA and social participation highlights the need for interventions to mitigate pain and reduce activity limitations, as we would have expected. But it also draws attention to the importance of the role of instrumental supports in maintaining, perhaps improving social participation for people with OA. And importantly, it is not only having and making use of instrumental supports that appears to mitigate the negative impact of activity limitations on social participation, but also perceptions of the availability of support that may encourage or help individuals living with OA to participate socially and ultimately increase the overall likelihood of healthy aging within this large group within our population. So thank you very much for your attention, and happy to take questions. I see we're past the time a bit, but happy to take questions.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Perruccio. That's very interesting. I appreciate your time today. And I will, just like you said, we are at the official end of our 30-minute webinar timeframe, but we will stay on for questions. For anybody who does need to hop off, I just will give a very brief shout out to our December 18th webinar that I hope you can join us. That will be with Dr. Kate Queen, the Medical Director of Lifestyle Medical Center, presenting on lifestyle medicine and caring for patients with OA. So that's on the 18th, and I hope that you can tune in for that. But coming back to today's presentation,
I'm also happy
to remind everybody to chat in any questions that you have in the chat box. I'd be happy to read those out. And I do actually have a couple of questions. One is, you included sex as a covariate in your analyses. Was there any consideration of potential differences in the associations examined between men and women? And if you could just get a little closer to your mic and speak into that.
Yes, can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, very good. For those that can't stay on, if there are questions, you can certainly email me after the presentation. I'd be happy to take those as well. Okay, yes, sex. While some studies have suggested that the relationship between activity limitations and social participation may differ by sex, or that social support may differentially impact the association between activity and subsequent participation by sex, findings have in fact been quite inconsistent in the literature. We did examine this and did not find differences in these relationships between men and women, nor did we find, in fact, and this was assessed in the first place, nor did we find differences in the structure of the latent factors themselves. So that is activity limitations, the instrumental supports, perceived and received, and the diversity and intensity of social participation. So no differences by men and women in that respect. Now, it may be that the inconsistencies across studies may stem from a lack of studies examining changes in each of these factors and how changes relate to one another by sex rather than status. Or it may be that they may stem from restricted age considerations in a number of studies. There has been work that has shown possible sex differences in the associations between social participation and social supports and networks, in fact, and broader well-being measures such as self-rated health and satisfaction with life. This is not something that we investigated, although the plan certainly is to assess this as longitudinal data becomes available. Again, considering not status, but changes in these factors over time and their subsequent association, not only with changes with other factors in the model, but also with overall well-being. So yes, there's always sex considerations. There's still ongoing work to determine how different the associations are. Perhaps one more comment. There are suggestions that women have larger social networks than men, for instance, so there are those differences. But the relationship between the networks then and support, or networks and social participation, that's where there are inconsistencies in whether those associations differ by sex, rather than what constitutes the individual factors themselves. I don't know if that gets to the question about the sex piece there.
I think it does. I appreciate your thorough response and offering those various considerations. Another question, your consideration of restricted activity was based on self-report. Any thoughts on the use of objective performance-based functional measures?
Okay, there is no consensus on whether function should be defined objectively, as you suggest, using performance-based measures, or subjectively using self-reported activities, as we did in the study. Some, in fact, recommend inclusion of both, as they may provide different but also important complementary information. You will recall that when describing the CLSA, the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, I said that we used the tracking sample, which included questions concerning difficulties with activities of daily living. The CLSA also includes what is called the comprehensive sample. Individuals in this case had home visits, which included physical measurements, and they also attended assessment centers where physical measures and tests were performed. And these included performance-based measures. The ones of relevance here would be the timed up and go test, the chair rise test, and the third one is the timed 4-meter walk test. Unfortunately, individuals in the comprehensive sample were not asked the activities of daily living questions that those in the tracking sample were asked. So we did consider a modified model using these performance-based measures in this other sample, but the model fit was actually quite poor. I suspect the poor fit was due to the fact that the 3 performance-based measures relate to specific tasks and don't consider the range of activities that are performed daily, for which individuals may have difficulty and ultimately which may impact social participation. It would have certainly been ideal to have the self-report and the performance-based measures considered together, but unfortunately that was not possible in the study.
Thank you. I know it can be challenging to try to adapt a research environment to be as close to real function or real life action as possible. But thank you.
And I will say, I mean, these individuals were exposed to a lot of questions, really long surveys. It would have been ideal, of course, to measure absolutely everything on everybody. But certainly more thought had to go into than doing it that simply, of course.
Right. I know from my research days, you do want to get as much information as you can if somebody is coming in while balancing patient burden as well. So I certainly.
Absolutely.
Well, I don't see any other questions that have come in, so I think this will conclude our session today. I very much thank you again, Dr. Perruccio, for your time today and a wonderful presentation. And thanks everyone for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you to everyone.
Have a great day, everybody.